In this lesson, we'll learn how to blur an image using filters here inside of Photoshop. Okay, great. So this is the Lesson 37 Begin file. And when it comes to blurring an image, that sounds like, yeah, that's a pretty simple process. Really, either an image is blurred or it's not blurred. But inside of Photoshop, it's really not quite that simple. Because if we come up here to the Filter dropdown, you'll notice here, if we come to Blur, Photoshop has a number of different types of blurs that can be applied to an image. Now, obviously, we're not going to go over all of these different blur filters here in this lesson. I'm going to show you a couple that I use probably more frequently than some of the other ones. The first one I'd like to show you here is this Gaussian blur. So we'll go ahead and select that. And I've got my Beach 01 layer selected here. And you can see here, this is a pretty simple blur. It really only has one setting to it here. And I can preview that either in this window here, or with this check mark ticked right here, I can preview it on the actual canvas as well. So, you know, if we're blurring an image, then we may have sort of a vision in mind for the amount of blur that's being applied to it, but we can control that with the Gaussian blur right down here with this radius slider. So as we begin to ramp the radius up here, you'll see that more blur is applied to our image. If we dial this all the way up, you're going to see here that basically most of our image is completely obliterated. So obviously it depends on how much blur you're wanting to apply to an image, but the Gaussian blur is typically the blur that I go to when I'm trying to blur a specific area. Now, let me go ahead and hit OK on that and say we've blurred that. So if I hit the undo button and redo, you can see how much of the detail in this image was lost because of the blur that we applied. Now, I want to go ahead and hide this layer for right now. I'm going to come down here to the car layer, and I'm going to show you the next type of a blur, which is going to be a motion blur. But I'm going to also show you a better way to apply this. So, in a previous lesson, we learned about smart objects here inside of Photoshop. Now, for this particular layer, I'm simply going to right-click on this, and I'm going to convert this object, or rather this layer, to a smart object. I know that it's a smart object is created simply because of that little icon in the corner of the layer thumbnail. And remember, a smart object is preserving all the original attributes, all the original conditions of this layer before that smart object was created. So if we wanted to come in and free transform and really warp this thing up, we could always come in and look at the original just simply by double-clicking on that icon. And it's going to open up that smart object in a new document tab here. Now, we could also make changes inside this and then save that particular file before closing it, and those changes would be replicated over to our smart object right here. But that's not the point of this lesson. The point of creating a smart object for this particular motion blur is so that I can show you how to use a smart filter. Obviously, a smart object, you apply a filter to it, it's going to be called a smart filter. So in this case, let's come up to Filter and Blur. And most of your filters should be available to you with a smart object. We'll just come over here and we'll choose the motion blur. Now you'll notice that a few of them are grayed out. That indicates they're not available, but let's come over to motion blur. All right, great. So again, as with the Gaussian blur, we have a preview window here. You can see if I click and I kind of pan around, the moment I click in there, we're looking at it in an unblurred state. We're previewing it on the canvas because this box here is checked. But with the motion blur, this is very, very simple. All we need to do is set an angle. So if we come in and dial this little thing around, maybe we want that to be at 90 degrees. Let's just manually put in that 90. You can see here what that looks like when it's blurred up and down. Now, if we want to blur this up and down, by all means, but really personally, I'd prefer to blur this from right to left. So that, I mean, this is obviously a very fast car. We want it to have a little bit of almost a speed component to the image, whatever the case. We'll just come over and dial that back over to where we're at 0 again. And the next setting down here is for the distance of the blur. Now, obviously, a very small distance in terms of pixels is going to mean very little blur. So there, you almost can't even tell that's a motion blur being applied. But if we, again, begin to ramp that up and really dial that blur up, you can start to see a lot of blur happening on the front and the back sides of our car. So let's go ahead and set that at about 65 pixels. That'll work. But watch what happens when I click OK. We've got some information that's been applied below our smart object here. Now again, you can see here that we have a little icon here indicating that a filter has been applied. But with the smart filter, you can see here a smart filter comes with a mask. That's what this little icon right here is. So again, just as with layer mask, we can actually select this mask and we can actually begin to paint into it as well. So we can come in here, we can hide the mask just like so. We can come in and actually hide the motion blur if we want, simply by clicking on that little eye. We can actually even come back in here if we double click the words motion blur and readjust our blur. Now this is what using a smart filter, where that becomes very, very useful, because as with this Beach 01 layer, if we wanted to blur out that, we would have to undo back if we wanted to make changes to that blur. In this case, we can come in and maybe tone that blur down to maybe around 50 pixels, come in and hit OK, and it's updated just like so. Now, I'm going to come in and grab my brush tool, and we'll just simply come in and grab kind of a soft round brush, and I'm using a pretty large one here, and I'm just going to paint black into our mask. Maybe Alt-right click and make my brush a little bit larger. Maybe drop the opacity down a little bit. And I can always hit X if I paint a little too far to paint white. All right, fantastic. And now what we've basically done is we've created kind of this look to where the back half of the car is a bit blurred, but we've still got this nice, crisp, clean front half of the car. So that's kind of the effect I was going for. Now I'm going to hide that layer, and let's come down to Beach 2, because with Beach 2, I want to approach that Gaussian blur a little bit differently. So with the Gaussian blur, again, remember, we want to go ahead and just create a smart object out of that layer. And let's come up and apply that, just like so. Now let's say for whatever reason we wanted to just blur out these palm trees and kind of the sky behind. So we'll go ahead and dial that up to a pretty good pixel radius there. Hit OK. And again, we can come in and grab our mask that was created. Now we can collapse that just like so if we want. But I'm going to come in and grab my mask. In this case, let's grab a hard round brush at 100% opacity. And now we can go about the process of basically painting this blur out of these buildings right here. Now, obviously, we would probably want to be a little more careful the closer we get to our trees. But again, it's just a mask. We can always paint back into it using white if we get a little bit of that blur painted out that we actually did want. So you can see how useful this smart filter feature inside of Photoshop becomes when you're really only wanting to kind of selectively apply a filter to a specific area in your image. So in this lesson, we've learned how to blur an image using a couple of Photoshop's blur filters. Now to contrast that, in the next lesson, I want to go ahead and move forward and show you how we can begin to sharpen an image.